Welcome back. Tonight we have a special bigger picture conversation on nuclear power around the world post-Fukushima. Joining me now are Paul Gunter, the Director of Reactor Oversight Project at Beyond Nuclear, and Kevin Camps, Radioactive Waste Watchdog at Beyond Nuclear. Let's get back to it. I have a graphic of the human body here and the various types of compounds. We begin tonight with the bigger picture conversation beyond Fukushima. On the afternoon of March 11th, 2011, a massive 9.0 earthquake struck just off the main island of Japan, rattling that nation to its core. Nestled on the east coast of Japan, not too far from the epicenter of that quake, was the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. The plant with 6 nuclear reactors, 3 of which weren't designed to handle an earthquake of that magnitude. Right after the ground started shaking, reactors 1, 2, and 3 at the plant went into automatic shutdown. Reactors 4, 5, and 6 were already shut down for inspection. The main power source to keep the reactors cool, the electric grid, was knocked out by the earthquake, so 13 emergency diesel generators immediately kicked in to keep the reactors cool. But within 10 minutes, the emergency cooling systems at Reactor 1 failed, and radioactive fuel rods within the reactors began to melt down. But things are about to get a lot worse. Approximately 50 minutes after the earthquake, a giant 45-foot tsunami slammed into the east coast of Japan and right into the Fukushima Daiichi plant. It swept across the plant's seawalls and flooded the turbine buildings, shutting down the emergency diesel generators and cutting off critical cooling to the reactors. At this point, the operators of the Fukushima plant knew they had a crisis on their hands. At approximately 3:41 in the afternoon, less than an hour after the earthquake, TEPCO, which operated the plant, notified the authorities that they had a first-level emergency on their hands. Reactors were melting down. To buy themselves time, operators began relieving pressure from the reactors by releasing radioactive steam out of the reactor buildings and into the air. And in a frantic attempt to keep the reactors cool, nearby seawater was pumped into the plant. But that wasn't enough. And there's not much else that plant operators could do since the radiation around the plant was spiking. Soon, the reactor buildings began exploding. One day after the earthquake, on March 12th, Reactor 1 suffered a hydrogen explosion, collapsing its roof. Over the next few days, reactors 2, 3, and 4 would give way to similar hydrogen explosions, mangling the reactor buildings and exposing highly radioactive spent fuel, which was stored in pools built into the ceilings of the reactors, into the atmosphere. Helicopters flew in to drop seawater into the crippled reactor buildings, trying to preserve the spent fuel pools from igniting. Meanwhile, on the ground, teams of TEPCO workers began working in shifts to bring the melting down plant under control. These shifts were essentially suicide missions, as radiation levels were well above lifetime dosages. During that March, an estimated 900,000 terabecquerels of radiation were released into the air. That's roughly 1/6 of the radiation released during the Chernobyl nuclear crisis, but again, this was just during the month of March. Between then and December of 2011, when TEPCO finally said the plant was stable, more than 300 workers were exposed to lethally high levels of radiation, and millions of gallons of highly radioactive seawater were dumped into the ground and the ocean. The effects of this radioactive dump are still not known. In February of this year, TEPCO began pouring cement around the plant as part of a decommissioning process, a process that operators believe could take as long as 30 years. But despite assurances from TEPCO that the plant is stable, evidence shows the nuclear crisis is still far from resolved. The Unit 4 reactor building, with tons of radioactive fuel and waste still stored in its roof, is leaning and in danger of toppling over and triggering a chain reaction, radioactive fire that could blow exponentially more radiation into the atmosphere than even Chernobyl did. And radiation levels at Reactor 1 recently reached all-time highs. Yet, Japan is still moving forward with nuclear power. Just this month, the reactor at the Oi nuclear plant was turned on, marking the first time a Japanese nuclear reactor was operational since the March earthquake. The question is, have the lessons of Fukushima been learned? And not just in Japan, where the crisis continues and could worsen, but also have they been learned in the United States? That's the topic for tonight's bigger picture discussion. Joining me now are Paul Gunter, the Director of Reactor Oversight Project at Beyond Nuclear and 2008 recipient of the Jane Bagley Lehman Award for Environmental Activism, who's been on the front lines fighting back against nuclear power for more than 30 years, and Kevin Camps, radioactive waste watchdog at Beyond Nuclear, who's testified before officials at the highest levels of the U.S. federal agencies dealing with radioactive waste management, including the Department of Energy, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and the EPA. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Tom.
First of all, was there anything in that setup that, Paul, that was in error?
Not at all. I mean, this is we've set a precedent now with nuclear accidents that I think is going to remain with us. We're certainly concerned about the future now, and certainly the future of residents in Japan.
Yeah, and Kevin, it's been 16 months now. Is Fukushima anything close to being out of the woods?
Well, just in the last couple weeks, there was a breakdown in the cooling system in the Unit 4 pool for high-level radioactive waste storage. So the fear for many, many months since the beginning of this catastrophe was that the Unit 4 pool could suffer a catastrophic drain down of cooling water from a large earthquake. But what was shown repeatedly now over the course of months is that simple breakdowns of the mechanics will start that pool to boiling. And if it boils for long enough, for a couple, 3 days, it's going to boil the cooling water down to the tops of the irradiated nuclear fuel, which can then catch on fire. So it doesn't take a big earthquake to lead to that catastrophic release of 10 times Chernobyl that you mentioned.
Wow. Now, Paul, when did this whole idea of putting nuclear waste on the roof of a 10-story building come along? I mean,
this is a 1960s vintage design from General Electric that essentially they decided that the shortest distance between refueling the reactor and temporarily storing the nuclear waste was a fueling channel to a pool that's 40 feet deep, that's 6 stories up. So it's on alignment with the reactor vessel head. What this does, though, is it puts the, hundreds of tons of nuclear waste in a very vulnerable position, and this is our concern today.
So this was done so that they could get the rods into the reactor and out of the reactor more conveniently than having to lift them all the way down to the ground or lift them up from the ground.
This is a quick and dirty solution, as this whole Mark I reactor has turned out to be.
Yeah, and this was designed by
General Electric.
And yet it's operating in Japan.
Well, it's actually GE Hitachi now.
Yeah, it's remarkable. I've got a couple of graphics here I'd like to go through. Actually, here's the number 2 is the Fukushima. This is the Fukushima reactor. Are we showing it on the? Here it is. Here it is, and it's we can show it on the plasma here. This is the spent fuel pool. Is that it? That's
right here.
Oh.
This is the heavy-duty crane that moves fuel in and out, and there's a channel between the vessel head and the spent fuel pool. So you see, this is the shortest distance.
Right.
And originally they thought the fuel was only going to be in there a matter of months before it was reprocessed or hauled off to a high-level radioactive waste repository. Of course, none of those have turned out to be viable options now. So the fuel has been primarily accumulating over decades and getting in denser and denser storage configurations up here in this elevated storage configuration.
Remarkable. And this is the actual reactor vessel here?
Yes.
And then everything around it basically is concrete and coolant?
There's a steel shell here that is called the dry well. It's 1.5 inches thick. It's basically welded plates together. But this is essentially this component and this 18-foot diameter wet well, as it's called. It's a hollow donut that contains 1 million gallons of water. This is what's credited for the containment of a severe accident at these GE Mark I designs. Of course, this is 1/6 the volume of the larger dry containments like you would see at 3 Mile Island or the pressurized water reactor. So this was inherently undersized as a GE competitive plan so that they could build these things cheaper and quicker and be competitive with these larger designs.
Now, at Fukushima, at the various reactors at Fukushima, what parts of these things failed?
The torus failed and ruptured. In fact, what happened during the accident, as they lost cooling to the reactor pressure vessel, the fuel, which is a zircaloy cladding, when zircaloy interacts and overheats, it generates hydrogen gas. In fact, zirconium is used in high explosives. So you have 100 tons of nuclear waste in these reactors and hundreds more in these fuel storage ponds that are surrounded by zirconium, which is used for high explosives. So, you know, when this stuff overheats, it burns like an intense flare, generating hydrogen gas. And of course, the hydrogen gas found an ignition point when they tried to vent the torus so that the pressure would be released and the gas would be released, but it found an ignition point and it blew out these outer structures and ruptured the primary containment.
And that happened in how many of the 6 reactors?
It happened in the 3 operating reactors, and the 4th unit, Unit 4, which was not operational at the time. Right now, it's thought that hydrogen gas generated in one of these other operating units, 1 through 3, somehow was vented in by a common route into Unit 4, and that's what caused the explosion in Unit 4.
This is the explosion.
That was number 1.
That was number 1.
The first explosion.
Okay, and the it's remarkable. And that spent fuel pool up at the top in Unit 4 is still there. Kevin, the building is, you said, listing? Is that the word?
Yeah, and has been since almost the beginning of the catastrophe. So it's described as listing. The New York Times last week called it tilting. There's actually 2 bulges in the walls, the exterior walls of the building, which is not a good sign. Despite all of this, Tokyo Electric Power Company assures everybody everything's fine, except when a high-level government minister went there at the end of May, it was disconcerting that he said to the press that were following him around in radiation suits, "Oh, this is a good structure, it's good up to a 6.0 earthquake." Well, that's not what's being discussed. What's being discussed is the 90% probability that there will be a 7.0 earthquake in the next 3 years at that site. Could bring the whole building down, that waste could go up in flames.
More of tonight's bigger picture conversation beyond Fukushima right after this break.